Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. I'm Jim Scott, President and CEO of Applied Policy, a health policy and reimbursement consulting firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. My colleagues and I invite you to join us at these gatherings each month as we explore critical issues shaping American healthcare. More than 1 in every 10 Americans has diabetes, a disease that can lead to a wide range of potentially devastating consequences, among them cardiovascular disease, nerve and kidney damage, and vision problems. Technology has revolutionized the management of diabetes during the last decade, offering patients increased safety and self-sufficiency. But according to leading researchers and clinicians, the revolution in diabetes self-management, powered by evolving technologies, has just begun. Joining us today are 3 experts on the front lines of diabetes care. They are Davida Kruger, a certified nurse practitioner at Henry Ford Health in Detroit, Dr. Anders Carlson, Associate Executive Director at the International Diabetes Center in Minneapolis, and Julie Haverly from the Diatribe Foundation, headquartered in San Francisco. Welcome. As we begin our discussion, can each of you please give us some brief background on the focus of your organization, your role in it, and your interaction with diabetes patients? Davida, let's start with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. So I've been at the Henry Ford Health System grouping for the last 42 years. The name's changed a couple of times. I'm in the endocrinology group, and our focus there is largely on technology, diabetes, the new medications, making sure that we're always on the cutting edge so that we can be sure the patients are achieving treatment goal. And I'm in a dual role. I spend half my time in clinical practice and the rest of my time in clinical research, which means that I've had the pleasure of working on just about all of the devices that have come to market: insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitors, and also all of the newer medications that are on the market. And it's really important that we embrace those and understand it. But within the system, we have 5 different hospitals. We've just acquired a new one, and we're building and growing, and we're one of the larger health systems in the state of Michigan.
Thank you. And Dr. Carlson, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do now?
Sure. And again, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to join you on this really important topic. So I'm an adult endocrinologist and the director here at the International Diabetes Center. My organization has been around for almost 60 years, really focused on patient-centered care was really kind of our foundation, which was novel at the time. And today that's routine practice. But really, we try to put the patient at the center of everything we do, whether that's clinical care, which I'm a part of, and we have a fairly large endocrine group here in Minneapolis, probably the largest one in Minneapolis, and as well as clinical research. So just like Davida, we've worked on just about every device that's on the market currently here in the U.S. and we try to focus our research not only on making sure that these are safe, effective, and advantageous to patients and help their quality of life, but we also really want to make sure it's translatable to routine practice. So we spend a good deal of time working on how can we get this out in the hands of endocrinologists around the country, around the world. What about primary care? Maybe some other providers that might not be as familiar or spend as much time in the diabetes space. So we spend a good amount of time on implementation as well. But it's great to be here, and thank you.
And Julie, can you tell us about Diatribe and your role in it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. I work for the Diatribe Foundation. We are a nonprofit that provides education through a weekly e-newsletter that's free and a website to more than 6 million people a year. At Diatribe, I get to oversee the work and the efforts of the Time and Range Coalition, which is made up of 30 of the biggest names in diabetes. You have your Novo and your Lilly, your Dexcom and your Abbott. You have your American Diabetes Association and Breakthrough T1 T1D, formerly known as JDRF. And these 30 organizations have come together to promote the adoption and the use of continuous glucose monitoring metrics, or CGM metrics, of time and range for daily diabetes management. So what Davida and Anders are doing, we're promoting on a healthcare provider side, as well as to people who have diabetes and to the regulators who are making a lot of the decisions about whether or not we get to use this. This is incredibly meaningful work for me. I'm very passionate about it because I have been living with type 1 diabetes for more than a quarter of a century. And I have definitely benefited from the innovation that's happened in the diabetes world over the last 26 years, including having a very healthy pregnancy and now a 12-year-old daughter. So I now use my platform to educate and advocate for people like myself and for the millions of others who need and deserve support. So thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you all. And you all three are experts in diabetes, but not everybody in our audience is. So I was hoping we could start off and level set. And maybe Dr. Carlson, if you could tell us, what is diabetes and what causes it?
Sure. Yeah. Broadly speaking, diabetes it's a chronic disease where the main fuel of your body, glucose, is not metabolized as it is physiologically or biologically meant to be. And that's primarily related to insulin, the hormone that regulates glucose in the body. Glucose is really important to all your organs, et cetera, and it's really the only fuel that your brain can use. So it's very, very important to your nervous system. And essentially, there's two categories. There's type 1 and type 2. They have to do with how the insulin and glucose relationship has been disrupted. So in type 1, which is a little less common, although certainly there are millions of Americans with it, the body loses its ability to produce insulin. Whereas in type 2, broadly speaking, those people are resistant to insulin. So their body makes extra insulin, but then their muscles, organs, et cetera, are resistant to it. And the end pathway is kind of both the same, where the glucose in the blood rises. And if the blood glucose is too high for a prolonged period of time, that's where complications related to diabetes can occur, both at the level of large blood vessels like in the heart and the brain, but also in the tiny blood vessels in the kidneys, nerves, and eyes.
Thank you. And Davida, can you tell us a little bit about, is diabetes preventable? And are we doing enough to prevent it where it is individually and societally?
So if you talk about the type 1 diabetes that Anders just described, we don't necessarily have a way to prevent it. There is a new medication now. We're looking at type 1 diabetes as stage 1, 2, and 3. And if we catch the diabetes in stage 2, and screening is very, very, very important, there is an infusion we can potentially give that staves off the diabetes for maybe 2 years. And we don't know, as research continues, perhaps it will be longer. And it's for 8 years old and above. Now, think about that. If we could say to you, at least for 2 years, you won't have complications or things that would lead to complications, perhaps this would be an option. So there's a lot of screening going on nationally of relatives trying to find those individuals. So there's a genetic predisposition to type 1 diabetes. So no cure, but maybe we can stave it off right now. And every time we find something like this, maybe that's going to get us closer to a cure. For type 2 diabetes, there used to be a prototype, and we used to say overweight, individuals underactive, over the age of 40. And we now know that that isn't necessarily true. And in the 40 years when I came, there was a picture, there's no longer. And so we see type 2 diabetes in children. We see it in adults. In type 1 diabetes, we used to say it's only in children. We now see it in adults of all ages. And sometimes it gets confusing and people are misdiagnosed until we work with them longer. But if we had a less sedentary population if we had less obesity. And I am not blaming, please understand that, because I don't think someone wakes up and says, I want to have type 2 diabetes. But with the advent of more processed food, more fast food, I don't know about you, but I haven't moved away from the computer today. And tomorrow I'll see 15 patients virtually and I'll be sitting in front of a computer. So there are things we should be doing. Also, nobody teaches anybody about nutrition. And I think if we were better, and certainly when someone's diagnosed with whether it be 1 or 2, we want them to see a diabetes educator. We want them to learn about nutrition. So I think that there are things we could do better in society, and healthcare needs to own some of this about weight. And we do have some great medications now. We just don't have coverage for them. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. And Julie, what's your perspective on is diabetes preventable, and are we doing enough to prevent it?
I think Davida brought up a ton of great points. I was diagnosed as an adult with type 1 diabetes. So to her point that it's not a juvenile disease anymore. And I used to work at the American Diabetes Association, where we saw far too many children developing type 2 diabetes. I think focusing our efforts individually and as a society on healthier choices and behavior changes is critical. There are small things that can help prolong or prevent diabetes, but also those same things can really help the management of diabetes should it develop. So, I think it's just very important that, we all try to get up and move a little bit more, that we're making healthier choices, and that we're all doing our part, in the decision making that we have access to.
Thank you. And Dr. Carlson, when somebody gets diabetes, what's the typical sort of standard of care, or what kind of care do they get, and how does that go over the course of their illness?
Sure. So for a person with type 1 diabetes, the answer is insulin, the hormone insulin. And that is crucial to have access to every single day, every hour, every minute. They need insulin, or they can turn into a really dangerous metabolic state called ketoacidosis. So insulin by far is the mainstay for therapy for people with type 1 diabetes. And I think we'll probably get into a discussion a little later on the exciting technologies that we've all seen in the last decade or so. For people with type 2 diabetes, it's a little bit more varied. It sort of depends on where they are in their journey with diabetes, if they're brand new, if they're newly diagnosed, or if they've had a delayed diagnosis for a number of years. Typically, we start with non-insulin therapies for management. We always start, as Davida so nicely laid out, with diabetes education. It really is that lifestyle, diet, nutrition component that's the foundation of learning how to manage diabetes on your own. Diabetes it's a chronic disease that patients manage on their own. They don't see, they see us a handful of times a year, but they're living with it every day, making decisions about what to eat and how to exercise, and their sleep and stress and everything you can imagine that goes into your daily life can be impacted by diabetes. I will add, in the last few years, we've had some pretty exciting studies come in that prompt us to think about that person's cardiac risk, so their risk for heart disease and other kind of blood vessel problems, and their risk for kidney disease, because we know that those are two complications of diabetes. But we've had some really exciting breakthroughs in therapeutics, two large classes of medications that have been shown to not only help lower the glucose and help an individual manage their diabetes, but also significantly reduce their risk for some of these complications we've talked about. So a lot of times when we're seeing a patient, we sort of think about their glucose and their diabetes metabolism component, but we also look at their cardiovascular risk, their risk for kidney disease, risk for heart failure, and that sort of helps us decide which therapies to choose first. And like Davida mentioned too, these wonderful drugs that we have, one of their mechanisms is through weight loss, and so that's another component here of trying to manage obesity and overweight as a strategy for managing diabetes as well.
Can I just add, Jim, that
Of course.
when I first started in diabetes 42 years ago, we didn't have anything. We had sulfonylureas and we had mixed beef pork insulin and we had urine testing. And in fact, the Diabetes Control and Complications trial, which I was hired to do, we were able to do because in the late 70s, A1C was available, blood glucose testing was available, and the first insulin pump was available. And that study demonstrated not only that, but the importance of the team approach and diabetes education. But that was for type 1 diabetes. For type 2 diabetes, we just had nothing and we did not think of it as a serious disease. And I think we didn't think about it as a serious disease because we didn't have anything to give those people. So in 2024, as Anders has just described, we have 2 new classes of medication, which we use the minute we meet a person with type 2 diabetes. So it used to be basal insulin, basal insulin, basal insulin. Now we hold basal insulin, not that it's a bad drug, it's a marvelous drug. We know it's going to work, and we know that 70 or 80% of all people with type 2 diabetes at some point in their career of diabetes will need insulin. But we want to use those other medications because not only do they lower glucose, they help with time and range, they help with A1C, but they do everything that Anders just said with cardiovascular benefits, weight benefits, kidney benefits. And the other thing, and I know we're going to get to this, but I have to give my plug, is that every patient deserves to be on continuous glucose monitoring. I believe it's a right. I don't believe it's a privilege, and it doesn't matter what therapy, because we know the behavioral change from the data we see on continuous glucose monitoring can lower the A1C independently of anything else we do. So I just think it's a different time for diabetes. The numbers are staggering in terms of how many people out there. And the other thing is that Anders and I are in endocrinology practices. We can see a smidgy of all of those people diagnosed with diabetes. So we have to have forums like this to get the message out, because primary care are the people who are going to manage the majority of people with type 2 diabetes. And in some areas, they're also going to manage type 1.
Thanks. And so before we get into the advances in technology, I wanted to ask you, Julie, are patients getting what they need, even as far as the basic diabetes care that we just talked about going, or are there access issues to even that? And if so, what could we be doing better?
There are a lot of challenges, and there are groups that have access to these tools and are utilizing them to the fullest. There are groups of people who are afraid of the technology and worried about starting insulin or another non-insulin medication that can really help them. So the education that we're doing today, the education that we all do every day through our work, is incredibly important. The Time and Range Coalition is right alongside with DaVita trying to educate primary care physicians about diabetes technologies, because they really can empower patients to understand what's happening with their bodies and make the choices, whether it's medicine or behavior, that can really make a difference. And we all need to continue having these kinds of conversations, because there's a lot of barriers to access. Sometimes it's insurance, sometimes it's mindset, sometimes it's convenience. And so there are still far too many people in America who don't have access or comfort with these technologies and these medications to really be managing their glucose and their diabetes well. I mean, a study that came out about 2 years ago said that 50% of the 30 million Americans who have diabetes aren't achieving the glycemic control that they need to reduce the risk of complications. So we definitely, as a society, need to do better, and we can.
Thanks. Dr. Carlson, the last 20 years have witnessed what's been called a revolution in diabetes care. Is that an accurate characterization in your view? And is the revolution continuing?
Absolutely. I think it's been a really exciting time. And I agree with what Julie said, that there still are barriers. For decades, we used the A1C. We still use it. It's a great test. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, but it's good at a macro level or a population level, or even from a long-term standpoint for a patient. Kind of think of it as, ask yourself, if your kid was going out to the bus this morning and they asked you what should they wear, would you look at the last 3 months average of the temperature in your community to tell them what to do? Or would you look at the forecast for that morning, temperature changes, precipitation, et cetera? That's where we're at. With the A1C gives you a really nice 3-month picture of where things have been, but it doesn't tell you anything about what happened last night or is going to happen today. Whereas these technologies, primarily what Davida mentioned, the continuous glucose monitoring or CGM, gives you that minute to minute, really real-time data that you can act on. That's actionable. You can look at it and make decisions. So the 20-ish years that CGM has been around has really transformed our care. And Davida also touched on all the other breakthroughs we've had with pharmacotherapies, new medications, new ways to administer medications that can be dosed weekly, or even the insulins that can be dosed weekly. I mean, we have all these new options that we just didn't have before. And then I will say, for those people requiring insulin, so everyone with type 1, and again, the majority of people with type 2 eventually who require insulin, we have really tremendous breakthroughs in terms of automated insulin delivery. These insulin pumps that will connect with the CGM, read the blood glucose or the glucose level off of the CGM, and then give that individual more or less insulin depending on what that glucose level is. And those have been iterated upon and refined, and they keep getting better. There's still a long ways to go, and I think the point about primary care can't be emphasized enough. I think we all struggle in medicine, but particularly when you have very limited time with an individual for something as complicated and as complex as diabetes. There's sort of that do no harm mentality of, well, I'm sure there's things we could do, but you're doing okay right now. And it's sort of this clinical inertia that just keeps perpetuating, particularly people with type 2, but for everyone with diabetes. And I think that's really, we're at the stage, I think, where we have these wonderful tools, these great medications, and all of these systems that work together. By and large, yes, they're expensive, but they should be covered. We just now have to train the folks who are going to help patients implement it and help them just get familiar with it, not be afraid to increase insulin or increase the types of medications and the intensity of management. I think that's the next phase of this, these 20 years of breakthrough.
Davida, I want to explore in a little deeper something you said about continuous glucose monitors are not, it doesn't just tell the patient the number, but it also is sort of a treatment, because you've seen that it leads to behavior changes even when they're not on insulin. Can you tell us more about, for people in the audience that aren't familiar with a CGM, what's a CGM like? And then can you tell us a little bit more about why people need one?
Okay, absolutely. So continuous glucose monitoring has been actually around for more than 20 years. The first device, the Navigator, came out about 20 years ago. And just like insulin pumps, there has been iteration after iteration after iteration, to the fact that they are very, very tiny now. And the person who's wearing it gets to wear it for 10 to up to 15 days, depending on which device. And there's a teeny tiny wire that goes under the skin that pulls up interstitial fluid instead of whole blood. And that continuously gives us what's going on in their glucoses. And the person with diabetes not only can see that number at that moment in time, but they can also see graphs and pictures. And we can look at data remotely. So if you wear that on your, send the data to your telephone, your iPhone or whatever phone you have, it goes up into a cloud, and I can grab the data and see it on my side, so I can constantly assist the person with diabetes. And so they actually are phenomenal. They have less interference than if we did finger sticks. So if you are trying to do finger sticks or you're trying to do an A1C, if you have an issue with the red blood cells, even pregnancy, kidney disease, we know that certain ethnic groups glycate differently, and so their blood glucose and their A1C are different. We've done all the research to show that. So if we use continuous glucose monitoring, that gives us the best data. Plus, it's as Andrew said, it's actionable. So if you do a figure stick at 8 a.m., but don't do one again till 8 p.m., I have no clue what's gone on all day long. I don't know how to help you. If you tell me that you're having low blood sugar sometime during the day, I don't know how to help you. But if I have the continuous glucose monitoring, which tests constantly, like every minute, and uploads, I can go look and see, and I can be of assistance and help to you. Plus, what we have learned, which is a comment I made, and it's been published in articles by both Tom Grace and Jean Wright and Eden Miller, that shows all you have to do is place the sensor on the person with diabetes. And this was people who didn't necessarily were on insulin. And within 6 months, those A1Cs came down an average of almost 2% without a medication change, because the person got to see what was happening. When you're more active, when you have something to eat, when you're not active, and they make adjustments in their own life. I don't go home with my patients at night, and I always say that's a really good thing for them and me. But someone has to own their diabetes, and that's the person with diabetes. And so if I give them CGM, I have now given the tool to understand their diabetes, to manage their diabetes and intervene. And so we used to think that it was the sensors when they first came out, CGM, it's only for type 1 diabetes. And then we said, oh, maybe it's for type 2 diabetes if you take insulin. Now we're saying, wait. Maybe it's for anybody who breathes and has diabetes, because it makes so much of a difference. There's also research to show after I give a person a GLP-1, which is phenomenal, and that's one of the medications Andrews has been talking about, and I have tweaked it and gotten the best job I can. If I add a sensor to it, you can see almost another 0.5 to 1% lowering of the A1C. So it doesn't matter what the therapy is. It doesn't matter if it's type 1 or type 2, pregnancy, gestational diabetes. CGM makes sense for the better outcome for the person with diabetes, because it gives me the ability to help you, and I can do it remotely. And even during the pandemic, we could help people with diabetes because we could see their data. And we know that we can teach people how to use it remotely as well. So everyone should be afforded the opportunity to wear a continuous glucose monitor, whether it's type 1, type 2 diabetes or whatever they have. And the other thing now is that they are over the counter for people with diabetes. So if your insurance doesn't cover it, and I will say insurance has been, every year they're more and more generous with the opportunity to get CGM, but a person can get CGM. And I never make a judgment about what a person can afford. Here's what CGM is. Here's what it will do for you. Your insurance won't cover it. Do you still want it? And usually the answer is pretty well yes, if they can eke it out into their budget. So that's what we're doing. And I don't know how we would practice anymore without CGM, to be honest.
And Julie, I see you nodding. Can you share your thoughts on continuous glucose monitoring?
Yes, I, as a person living with diabetes, have been wearing a CGM, the various iterations that Davida talked about, since the early 2000s. I actually did a clinical trial, actually 2 of them, in the early 2000s, and I completely confirm that they have gotten more accurate. They have gotten much more comfortable to wear. They have gotten smaller. I trust the CGM that I wear now. I don't even have to calibrate it. So I probably shouldn't admit this, but I don't even know when the last time I did a finger stick was, because the CGM so accurately tells me not just where I am at that minute, because that is important, but where I'm going and where I've been. And if I have insulin on board, it takes that into consideration. And it is such an incredible tool that I used to, maybe take a day off here or there. I am now putting a second one on before my first one ends, because I don't want to miss any of the data. And for those of us with type 1 who are using automated insulin delivery, the ability for my CGM to tell my pump that I need a little bit more or a little bit less insulin when I'm stressed out or when I'm exercising. There are 42 factors that change your blood glucose levels. So my blood glucose is constantly changing. And the fact that I have a tool that captures that and helps me through it is critical to me being able to live the life that I want to live. So the quality of life aspect, I mean, we wouldn't ask people to drive a car to, across the country without information. We use GPSs, we don't drive blindfold. We know that information is power, and CGM for people with diabetes is the information that's power. And if I can just share a short little anecdote, I will never forget, probably about 5 years ago, I got a call from my endocrinologist. It was about my A1C. She left a message because I couldn't get to the phone. And I will never forget her words to me. She was so proud of me. She called and she said, "Julie, your A1C is perfect. Don't change a thing." But the reason I couldn't get to the phone was because I was so severely low, I couldn't actually stand up and get to my phone. And when I finally, got my treatment and rebounded from the low, I called her and I said, "We absolutely have to make changes. Please look at my time in range. Please look at my CGM metrics," which had uploaded to a cloud. And within an hour, we made changes to my basal rate, to my carb ratios, and cut out the lows. And that was the third one I had had that week. And we had completely cut that out. We never could have done that with an A1C. It takes that continuous glucose monitoring to be able to make those clinical changes just like that.
So Julie, it sounds like the technology is pretty good, but do you have a wish list of what you would hope that the next generation would be able to do, or anything like that?
Oh gosh, I mean, how much time do we have and how much funding do we have access to? No, I think for daily life with CGMs and automated insulin delivery systems, size is critical, and comfort and usability. So the insulin pumps are getting smaller, they're getting more durable. That is a step in the right direction. It's funny because we think of some conditions, some health conditions, as needing adaptive clothing. I've been saying I need adaptive clothing for the last 26 years because if I'm sticking an insulin pump somewhere, the weight is going to pull down my clothes. I have to have a pocket. I have to have access to it. And so the smaller they get, the more convenient they are for us to utilize. That addresses some of the access barriers that I was mentioning earlier. The more people we see wearing CGMs, the more people who have access to them. It really does help create a community. I mean, I never notice other people in the wild wearing CGMs, but let me tell you, my husband and my daughter point them out everywhere we go and sometimes drag me to them so that I can get to have conversations with them. But, just continuing to try to find ways to make them more part of our life instead of an obstacle in our lives is really helpful. I think that the algorithms that exist now are good. I think they can be better. There's a lot of opportunity for them to maybe adapt to a target range that people with diabetes, we all have different needs, different desires, and different hopes. And so if we could, personalize those, personalized care is always something that people who are living with diabetes want. I'm not a robot. If I was, and I never ate and I never got stressed and I never took a walk without programming my pump beforehand, everything would work perfectly. But I'm a human who wants to travel and do things spontaneously. And so my hope is that the technology will continue to evolve to be more adaptive to that. And I mean, let's be honest, I'm hoping for a cure.
Thank you. Dr. Carlson, where do you see the technology going next, and what are your views on that?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Julie on everything she said. I think we just need to keep improving on what we have. I mean, I think there's the short-term goals, which are smaller devices, better infusion settings. The big weakness with some of these systems is the infusion set. So the tubing that connects the pump to the under the skin space where the insulin goes in. No matter how sophisticated the algorithm is or how small the device is, that tubing is kind of a weak link that there's a lot of research going into, but that piece of it needs to be improved on, I think. Then the types of insulins that we use, we have these great short-acting insulins, but could they be faster? They're not quite as fast as a physiologic pancreas would put out into the bloodstream. So we need some faster insulins. And then I think, we've talked a lot about the complications and the reduction of heart disease and all these improvements that we can see. I think the one thing that we're a little late in acknowledging, but starting to now, is the psychological and emotional burden of diabetes on the individual. Like Davida said, we don't go home with patients. This is a 24/7 disease that there are so many variables and things that can go right, but there's also things that can go wrong. And we don't want these technologies to make it harder to live with this disease. So thankfully, as we've started incorporating this into almost every study that I'm a part of, we've seen that reductions in burden. So these devices, even though they're more sophisticated and complex and there's more parts to it and it requires a little bit more knowledge of how these systems operate, by and large, patients and people living with diabetes are feeling like this is helping empower them and reduce the burden of diabetes. But then, sort of long-term picture, I completely agree with Julie. I think cure is our ultimate goal for type 1 diabetes and for type 2. Type 2 might be a little bit of a different entity just because there's so many different factors that go into it that we discussed before, genetics and environment and social determinants of health and et cetera. But for type 1, where we need to get back some physiologic insulin, there's been some pretty big breakthroughs in that using stem cells. So I think there's, the future is looking good for that. Of course, it can't come soon enough, which is what we always hope for. But I'm optimistic that we'll have that, in our lifetimes.
And Davida, where do you see the technology going next?
Well, first of all, I think the technology is awesome, and having been around for the 42 years and used every generation, I look at what we have and I think, oh, this is so good, but I know more is coming, which is probably why I haven't retired. And I know I'm going to be doing clinical research, and I assume my friend Anders will be as well next year, on a new pod device that looks awesome, and a couple of other new pumps. So I think we also want the bionic pancreas to have glucagon because we want to prevent hypoglycemia. So what I see is not only smaller, easier to use, but I also see that the algorithms will become more and more sophisticated to meet the demands of the patient. And as they become more sophisticated, they also have to be simpler. And I think that's not an oxymoron, because we're now broadening the scope of who we're offering insulin pumps to as well. So again, before we used to put people through like pure hell to get an insulin pump. You had to do this, and it was like the Wizard of Oz and being sent back, Dorothy being sent back every time a person with diabetes came and said, I'm ready for a pump. No, you haven't done that. So now the insulin pumps that are on the market, you don't have to carb count. You can do a set dose of insulin, which probably is what most of our patients are doing. So more sophisticated algorithms, but ease of use, because in the world of diabetes, the pumps are now opening up, as it should, to type 2 diabetes. So one pump has already been approved. We're looking forward in 2025 for that to be approved as well. And it's a different subset of individuals that will need a different type of education, because when they came to the table, we didn't give them the same type of education as we did with type 1 diabetes. So I think that's what we're looking forward to. Julie didn't say this, but I bet this is on her list. I'd like to see a 30-day sensor, so that the person with diabetes only had to change that sensor once a month. Would be really nice. And I know companies are working on that. And again, faster acting insulins. And one other plug I would have, if you look at the number of people that will be diagnosed with diabetes over 65, or thank goodness we're living past 65. We need to think about a different kind of education for those individuals. I have two individuals, one's 94 and one is 96, that wears an insulin pump. The 96-year-old is on tubing and she does it herself. However, she's now living with family. And because we teach patients to be so independent, a lot of times when they're in a crisis situation that they need support or they're moving in with family members, they may not have that. So I think in the future so we do okay when kids go from pediatrics to adults, kind of okay. Because we forget that we've educated the parents. And now we have this 20-year-old who mom's been doing everything and we have to re-educate the 20-year-old. We need to start thinking about that on the other end of technology. And then finally, I would say is that in a clinical practice like Andrews and myself, we do prior auth without even thinking about it. We don't like it, but we do it. We know what needs to be in our notes. We know how frequently the patient needs to be seen to get coverage. It's killing us. It is drowning our practices and it is frustrating our patients. We need a simpler way to access insulin pumps, CGM, insulin. I had one of our endocrinologists frantic, and she pulled me out of a visit and said, talk to this person. And she was talking to the insurance company because they denied insulin in a person who had type 1 diabetes on an insulin pump. And my brain clicked and I said, I know why. They billed it to either Part A or Part D or B. And if you're on an insulin pump, you have to bill it to, I think it's D, not B, whichever it is. And I said, if we rewrite the prescription and we put that in there, can we have the insulin? She said, yes. Most brains don't work that way. So I think we need a lot of simplicity as we continue to grow technology, which thank goodness is not going anywhere.
And can I add to that? As we 100% agree, I mean, it needs to be simplified. The prior auths we're drowning in them. Thankfully, we have workarounds because we get so many of them. But again, looking to the future where 90% of people with type 2 diabetes are managed in primary care, these things will have to be simple to get primary care buy-in for prescribing and managing and implementing these and safely deploying them in their populations. The good news is there's some research to show that primary care providers are open to the idea and actually feel comfortable prescribing and ordering an automated insulin delivery because they don't have to know all of the minutia of settings and basal rates and so on that we've been so accustomed to with older pumps. And so when you ask them, how comfortable are you with these older pumps, they say, no, that needs to be an endocrine. But if you give me a pump where we just plug in a few data points of the patient, their weight or their total daily insulin, or even just kind of let them start for a few days and the algorithm learns what they need, and they have simplified settings and simplified boluses and longer sensors, all of the things we've mentioned, then I think we're ready for prime time in primary care. But for them to use it, it's the same thing. All of these barriers to implementation need to be sort of addressed first so that patients can successfully use it in that setting.
So it seems like a goal of care is glycemic control, and that's described by time in range. I think we can guess what that probably means, but I was hoping, Dr. Carlson, you could tell us what is time in range and why is it important? Because we're going to have some other questions where that's going to be an important concept.
Yeah. So time in range, this is a concept for CGM. Primarily. So looking at the trend of glucose, either over a day or over a 14-day period, whatever you look at. And what we're trying to achieve is as much time in a target range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. So that 70 to 180 range, we know from pretty decent studies, not as robust as we'd like to know, but that range kind of keeps patients in their safe spot in terms of complications, reduces the risks of complications, but minimizes their time in hypoglycemia, low blood glucose, or time below range, as we call it, which would be less than 70. We know that if someone gets hypoglycemia, that can be very dangerous very quickly. They can lose consciousness. If it happens while they're asleep and they're confused, it can be extremely dangerous. So we're trying to avoid that scenario while trying to keep the glucose from being too high to prevent some of those long-term complications. So when we talk about time in range, it's that time in 70 to 180. Now, our goal for that when we talk to patients is 70% or higher. So we're not trying to tell people you need 100% in that range. That's sort of, as it stands with our current therapies, that's probably unachievable and a little bit dangerous, because to achieve near 100%, you're almost always going to be giving those patients hypoglycemia, just like Julie experienced with her lower A1C. You might see a higher time in range, but that's at the expense of having more frequent hypoglycemia. So we really kind of focus on that 70 to 180, the higher we can get, but around 70% in that range correlates to an A1C of 7%, which is sort of our universal target for an A1C that we know sort of minimizes the risks of downstream diabetes complications.
So Davida, and both you and Dr. Carlson worked on something called the SECURE study that found that individuals who use insulin pumps can experience better glycemic control and better quality of life. So can you tell us a little bit about what that study was and what it found and how that relates to time in range?
So I'll just start by outlining it, and then Anders can jump in. So the uniqueness of this study is that it was done 100% in individuals who had type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes. They could have been on multiple daily injections, meaning a basal insulin and mealtime insulin, or just basal insulin to come into the study. And the FDA mandated, because we're moving into new territory, they mandated that we not only use the pump for daily life, but we had meal challenges and we had activity challenges to be sure that it prevented hypoglycemia. Now, this is an integrated pump, an AID pump, which means that they wear a sensor, and the sensor talks to the pump, and the pump's algorithm determines the insulin the person is supposed to have. The thing that was also unique, and we're going to see more and more, which I am loving, is that the FDA mandates how many individuals of other ethnicities that we had to put in every bucket to be sure that we are looking at type 2 diabetes. And we looked at buckets of A1Cs, so that it was really all coming, because if you look at if we look at healthcare, the individuals of ethnicities and different socioeconomic status, we know they're not getting the same care. And so we need to figure out how to make sure that the care is equitable, and it's not right now. And so this study did show that and the other thing is that no extra education was given to these individuals. So when we give a pump to an individual, we have diabetes education, medical nutritional therapy, all that kind of stuff. That was not part of the study. So we gave them the pump, we set up the algorithm, we taught them how to use CGM, and we let them roll. And in 3 months' time, there was almost a 1% lowering of the A1C. There was a bunch of other stuff, but that was the primary thing that we were looking at in a multicultural group. And in California, the pump does do Spanish as well. And they had Hispanic, those individuals that were not speaking, did not speak English, were using the pump in their hopefully their native language, because I realize there's a lot of dialects. But we try to reach out to so many individuals, which we just don't do a good job of doing in day-to-day practice. Anders?
Yeah, and I totally agree. It was such a representative study, and it was so nice to see that the algorithm was safe, effective, and actually had better outcomes in this population. So that was wonderful to see. I think two other kind of takeaways from that study for me: one, about half the patients in that study were already on GLP-1 drugs, and so this benefit that we saw in terms of A1C lowering, improvements in quality of life, et cetera, were in addition to GLP-1. So it's building upon that, the benefit that we've already seen with GLP-1. And then the second thing, having done that trial and other automated insulin delivery studies in people with type 2, I think, and Davida touched on this before, sort of the Wizard of Oz thing. Like, I think there's this mentality that people have to start at the most simple thing or the least sophisticated advanced thing, and then sort of fail their way up to the, well, we've tried everything else, now you qualify for this pump. And to me, it's almost more like, this is just a different way of managing it with insulin. So if we've decided that you need to move on to insulin, you could do it with basal insulin, you could do it with basal and 1 shot a day at meals, or we can try to automate it. And I think this is something that should be considered at the get-go, rather than having people, try one and not do well, because that just gets discouraging. It takes time, complications build up. And in the end, it becomes more expensive because now you've had all of this time of that patient not meeting their goals. Complications have developed. They've, had issues at home, and they've got stockpiles of other things that never worked. Whereas we could have just at the very beginning tried something that we know would be effective. And I think what we've seen is that this assumption that everyone needs to be super savvy with smartphone apps and, uploading to the cloud, like all of those things that we assume, you're not going to succeed on this unless you really know the ins and outs of insulin physiology and how sensors work. That's just out the window. I think we've just seen that patients can just put these things on and they're pretty intuitive, and there's enough kind of give or flexibility with the algorithms that they don't have to be perfect at carb counting. They don't have to be perfect at anticipating exercise or sleep. That ability for the algorithm to adjust based on the ambient glucose really kind of can pick up some of that slack that we otherwise would have placed that burden on the patient.
Julie, what are your views on the insurers requiring patients to sort of level up to qualify for an insulin pump?
I think it's incredibly sad. When I was diagnosed, I knew that I couldn't get one. I knew that it was going to take years, and I knew that the second I got it, it would change my life. And that is exactly what happened. I've been on a pump for, gosh, it's probably been 20 years now. And it is such a better way of managing my disease state. Patients shouldn't have to feel like they're failing, and they shouldn't be having the treatments that are going to help them reduce complications, live longer, live more active, healthy lives. That shouldn't be a punishment. And by holding them back, it becomes this punishment. And so we all really need to rethink the way that we approach this and not, fail to succeed, but succeed. We should all be working towards being healthier.
And I just want to add on to that absolutely, Julie. But I also think as we move into this next phase of automation and AID, that there is so few endocrinology practices in the country. Nurse practitioners and PAs have really rolled up their sleeves, both in endo and in primary care. And if we don't simplify the process, both in ordering, prescribing, PAs, education, and the device itself, we are going to cut off our nose to spite our face, because it has to roll into primary care, because we cannot manage all the people with diabetes, and they're seeing more than I am. And so we have to start thinking smarter about how to help our colleagues to help all the people with diabetes.
So Jim, I hope you picked up on that. So what you heard me as a patient say is I had to fight to get the tools I needed. Then you heard Davida talk about how she has to fight to get the tools that are needed in the education. There shouldn't be so much fighting. We need to be doing a better job. And from my perspective, my body's fighting itself. And so it's a constant battle, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Thanks for that. And so in the last few minutes, I want to talk about some policy changes. And Davida, you mentioned some things with Medicare. And since that's a large public program, the government plays a role in setting up its rules. Has Medicare rules and regulations for who can get an insulin pump kept up with commercial insurers and other types of insurers' approaches?
Medicare has led the way in terms of changes for CGM, and I applaud them. And they've been willing to listen to us and work with us. And there's a group of people that talk with Medicare, you know that, Jim. And we have been asking them to get rid of the test called a C-peptide because it means nothing and it just wastes money and time. So I think Medicare could do a better job with insulin pump therapy. The other problem is there's a mandate if a person's on an insulin pump that they have to be seen every 3 months. I'm dying. My next appointment is June. I'm going to be seeing them at home on the weekends just to get them their supplies. And I think we need to say for those individuals who need to be seen more frequently, let's do that. But let me judge, is it 4 months, 5 months, or 6 months? But that's killing us in terms of the frequency. And I understand they want to be sure that the products we prescribe are being utilized. But CGM is 6 months. Insulin pumps should be 6 months as well. Medicare is listening to us, but they're not up on pump stuff.
Thank you. And Dr. Carlson, more and more, this is sort of a little bit inside baseball, but insulin pumps and CGMs have traditionally been covered under insurers, what insurers call the medical benefit. More and more, they're moving to the pharmacy benefit, like the prescription drugs. Have you noticed that at all? And does that make any difference to patient access or how you deliver care?
Yeah, I think the move to the pharmacy channel has been huge, not only for us and ease of ordering, which exactly what Davida said, this has to fit into our workflow. And our workflow is in the EMR ordering things to the pharmacy. I mean, that's just very simple to do. To try to order something to a DME company is really complicated, really time consuming. It involves fax machines. I mean, it's so archaic. So having the pharmacy ability has been huge. But that started with the CGMs, and that made that process really streamlined. And now we're starting to see it with pump therapy. So commercial insurance is getting there. I think Medicare has a ways to go to get us to that point. But I think it makes it so simple. They're already going to the pharmacy for their other things. There's concerns with getting supplies in time if they're being shipped and all of the barriers, the prior auths that are hanging us up to get it through a DME just takes a lot longer and is more complicated. So to the extent that we can get anything through the pharmacy channel, I fully support that. And I think people with diabetes really appreciate it as well.
And it's cheaper to the patient when we go to pharmacy than DME.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then Julie, from a patient perspective, do you have thoughts on the move to the pharmacy channel?
So I do. Davida's right. It is much easier for us to gain access and to get refills. It is still sometimes very confusing, both for the healthcare provider and the patient. I found out halfway through this year that my CGMs moved from Durable Medical, which was one copay, to the pharmacy benefits. And my insulin pump is still on Durable Medical. So we need to continue to make it easier. And it is really helpful. So,
and Davida, how important is telehealth for you to be able to take care of your patients? And what happens with Medicare's telehealth availability if Congress or CMS doesn't act?
If they don't act, we are decimated, truly, truly, truly. We cannot get all the patients in. More than 50% of our care is done by telemedicine, and we do a good job because we can see their data. We work with the primary care, so we get blood pressures and weight. People can't take it. We have to see them every 3 months. People can't get out of their work situation, their home situation. They may need assistance with driving. We will be decimated. We're asking all of our healthcare providers to write to their Congress people. We've already sent them form letters. We're asking every healthcare provider to do this. Fingers crossed, we cannot lose telehealth. We just can't do that.
And I'll add, we were begging for this even before the pandemic. This is how diabetes management should be optimally done. It's just how it should be. So I completely agree.
And Julie, from a patient perspective, do you feel like when you have a telehealth visit, you're getting the care you need?
I do, because my doctors have access to my continuous glucose monitors and my records. They know exactly what my pump settings are, what is happening with my glucose, and it makes it incredibly easy to the point where I only see my endo twice a year, because through the tools that are available, my numbers are good, and we can touch base anytime we need to through telemedicine, and I'm incredibly grateful for that.
And electronic medical records help us as well.
And then also reviewing the data is even outside of a patient visit is an important part of care. Medicare has established some billing codes for what they call remote patient monitoring. Davida, can you tell us a little bit about what role remote patient monitoring, what is it and what role does it play in care?
Well, it comes into the remote monitoring visits, and then if there's some visits in between that we have to look at continuous glucose monitoring, or the patient is having a problem, we do have an opportunity to go in, pull up their data, have a conversation with that patient, and be able to bill on the time that we have spent. There are some codes for telephone that we tend not to do. We tend to try and get the patient in, or we try to do a virtual visit. But again, it is paramount to our ability to provide high quality care to that individual who may have an hour at lunch. And even for the person not working, that doesn't mean they have the ability to come see us. And we're now in 4 different sites, and we're all over the state. And in some situations, they can't get in to see us. And of course, we have winter here. So we have snow. We'd like them to still come during the winter, but we can't get them here.
Dr. Carlson, in your experience, is the reimbursement amount, the payment amounts for doing remote patient monitoring adequate to cover the time it takes you and resources to meet the requirements of doing the RPM?
The short answer is absolutely not. It really just isn't quite there yet. It's coming there, but we're seeing some movement, but no, there's a long way to go for remote monitoring. I will say that the ability to bill for CGM interpretation, even though it's pretty minimal, it's not nothing. And for those of us in endocrine and primary care who don't typically really use fee-for-service models, it can actually be a revenue generator for an endocrine department or a diabetes education group to bill for interpretation of CGM. So that's actually been one of the things we've used to get other primary care clinics on board with using CGM.
Thank you. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you all one final question. Julie, what's the one thing you'd like our audience to take away from this discussion?
I think it's really important to remember that nobody chooses to have diabetes, that living with diabetes is hard, and that there are 19 million Americans with diabetes who aren't meeting their goals. There are wonderful tools that can help these people tremendously. We shouldn't have to spend our lives fighting our bodies and the system that is, keeping various tools and therapies at arm's length, because diabetes is hard. And there are tools that help us. Some of us make it look easy, but there needs to be so much more education and access. So that would be my biggest thing. If you're living with diabetes, I see you. I know it's hard. I know it's every day, all the time. But there are things that can be done to help. And I'm really grateful for AP having us here today to talk about these things.
Dr. Carlson, what's the one thing you would like our audience to remember?
Yeah, I agree. Same with Julie. I think we have these wonderful tools. They just need to get used by a much broader population. I think I would encourage everyone to not think about diabetes in the same light as other chronic diseases. It is a minute-to-minute disease, whether it's you have type 1 or type 2. If you compare it to other things that you maybe read about and talk about, like hypertension, if you have hypertension, you're not thinking about it the minute you wake up, how it's going to impact your breakfast, your lunch, your workout, your nap, your kids, your stress. Same with asthma. It's not a minute-to-minute decision like it is with diabetes. It's just a different disease that requires a lot more support to successfully manage it. And if for anyone out there who can get their hands on a CGM and wear it and experience what it's like to think about your blood glucose 24 hours a day, I encourage you to do it. I think it's a really important exercise, and we often do it in similar programs like this when we have them in person. But again, I'm so thankful that we had the opportunity to have this discussion today.
And Davida, we will give you our final thought. What's the one thing you'd like our audience to remember?
You know, it's never, ever a good time to have diabetes, but this is about the best time in all of the history that I've had in the last 40 years. I hope we continue to grow and get better therapies, better technology for our people with diabetes, and that our insurance and healthcare partners hold our hand rather than holding us back to provide this care for people with diabetes. And thank you so much for organizing this and including me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. Thank you, Davida Kruger, Dr. Carlson, and Julie Haverly for sharing your insights about the present and future of technology in the treatment of diabetes. We hope you will all join us for our next forum in December, when two Washington insiders take an in-depth look at the future of healthcare during the Trump administration. Before I close, we just sent a message in the chat with a link to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and view our Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum website for more in-depth insights into the forces that are shaping current health policy. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.